Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video, we're going to be talking about the years from 1906 to 1914. So that basically covers the beginning of the State Duma to the beginning of World War I. So let's get started. First of all, just where we left off last time, the October Manifesto, which was drafted by Sergei Witte, promised civil liberties and the establishment of an elected parliament known as the Duma. Now, the October Manifesto was proclaimed in response to enormous industrial action, whereby workers from all walks of life protested in the streets and basically brought all of Russia's major cities to a halt. So facing severe pressure, Tsar Nicholas agreed to the October Manifesto and to the establishment of the Duma. All state laws were to pass through and be approved by the Duma. And as I just said, Nicholas agreed to these reforms out of necessity so as to prevent further revolutionary action. He didn't want to agree to reforms. He was very much a Tsar who believed in his divine right to rule and was very much an autocrat. But out of necessity, he did agree to the terms. This picture here shows the opening ceremony of the first State Duma in 1906. So the electoral laws, because Nicholas agreed to an elected Duma, but the electoral system was not particularly equal or fully representative. The electoral laws, which were drafted in December 1905, allowed only male landowners over the age of 25 with estates of more than 200 hectares to vote directly for their representatives. Peasants only had an indirect vote, whereby they could elect someone to vote on their behalf, but that someone to vote on their behalf had to fit into the above category. And other social groups, over 60% of the urban working population, were completely excluded from voting. That included factory workers from businesses employing less than 50 employees, construction workers, and casual tradesmen. Women were certainly not allowed to vote, and soldiers were also not allowed to vote. So, not a particularly representative electoral system. The resignation of Sergei Witte and the rise of Pyotr Stolypin. Following the October Manifesto, Sergei Witte was appointed acting prime minister, but Nicholas grew to resent Witte for compelling him to make reforms that he felt were unnecessary. Basically, as soon as he had agreed to the October Manifesto, Tsar Nicholas decided that he didn't want to make these reforms, and he felt as though Witte had pressured him into making these reforms. Nicholas is quoted as saying the following: "Curse the Duma, it's all Witte's fault." Now, if you remember back to a couple of videos ago, Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, pleaded with Nicholas to listen to Witte, and Witte was an extremely significant figure, but at this point, Nicholas was not a big fan of Witte. As a result, Witte resigned as prime minister on the 22nd of April, 1906, just before the opening of the First Duma. At the same time, Pyotr Stolypin was chosen to stem the tide of revolution and to strengthen the autocracy. Nicholas regretted the reforms that he agreed to, and he appointed Stolypin to try to take back some of the autocracy and also stem the tide of revolution. So in April 1906, Stolypin was appointed Minister of the Interior, and a few months later in July, he was promoted to Prime Minister. In addressing the challenges faced by the Tsarist regime, Stolypin said his guiding principles were suppression first, and then and only then reform. So by suppression, he means suppressing the revolution, suppressing the industrial actions that were taking place, basically putting an end to these revolutionary actions. The fundamental laws. Now, this is we can make an interesting comparison between the October Manifesto and the fundamental laws. Nicholas, first of all, is quoted as saying, "I created the Duma not to be directed by it, but to be advised." Now, that sounds very different to what the October Manifesto promised, which is that all state laws must go through the Duma. But on the 23rd of April, 1906, Tsar Nicholas issued the fundamental laws. Now, these outlined how Russia's new political system would function, and they proclaimed that the Tsar appointed his own ministers who were accountable to him and not to the Duma. The Tsar also retained complete control over foreign affairs, military matters, and the direct declaration of states of emergency. So if we link that to the present day, with the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen states go into what are referred to as states of emergency, which basically gives the police much more power to do as they will to try to keep people safe. Now, Nicholas basically said that he had complete control. The Duma had no control over the ability to declare a state of emergency, as well as the foreign affairs and military matters. On top of that, now he also had supreme power. If we remember back to the October Manifesto, it proclaimed that all laws must go through the Duma. The fundamental laws essentially flipped that and said that all laws would require the Tsar's approval. So he still had supreme power over the government. On top of that, Article 87 of the fundamental laws stated that under exceptional circumstances, the Tsar could dismiss the Duma and legislate on his own. So basically, if he didn't like the Duma, but under the guise of exceptional circumstances, then the Tsar could just dismiss the Duma and rule unopposed. Now, that brings us to the First Duma, which ran from April to June of 1906. So two significant revolutionary parties, the Socialist Revolutionaries, or the SRs, and the Social Democratic Labour Party, or the SDs, boycotted elections for the First Duma, rejecting the very principles of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government. Just as a quick aside, the Social Democratic Labour Party split into two factions a few years prior, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Now, we will discuss them in greater detail as they will be quite significant later on. But back to the First Duma. The First Duma opened on the 27th of April, 1906, 4 days after the proclamation of the fundamental laws. And as you can see over here, here are the results of the First Duma. We've got the cadets won 184 seats. Now that's 37% of the vote. 37% of the vote. The cadets were a progressive liberal party that advocated for further reforms, including protections for civil rights, particularly for workers, and more representative government. Not really in line with Nicholas and Stolypin's desire to take back some of the autocracy. The Trudoviks gained 124 seats, so they were the second most voted party. So that's 20% of the vote. Now, the Trudoviks were a breakaway faction of the Socialist Revolutionaries, which was a radical socialist party, as I said before, that believed that peasants and workers were the key revolutionary classes. So even though the SRs boycotted elections for the First Duma, the Trudoviks were a breakaway faction that ran and did quite well in the first election. So this doesn't look like a particularly good spread of parties for the First Duma from the perspective of Nicholas and Stolypin. The First Duma issued 391 statements criticizing the actions of the government and ended up being dissolved by Tsar Nicholas after only 73 days. As such, the Tsar ruled without a parliament for many months until February 1907. So the First Duma, from Nicholas's perspective, was not a success, did not align with his views and ideals, and so he dissolved it. That's what, according to Article 87, these were exceptional circumstances, and he was able to dissolve the First Duma. The Second Duma ran from February to June of 1907. Now, the SDs and the SRs decided to end their boycott and participate in the elections for the Second Duma. They realized after the First Duma that by being a part of the Duma, they could wield considerable power and at least have some say in the running of government, and essentially they could be agitators from the inside. The Second Duma was more radical, in fact, than the first. As we can see, the Trudovics, so that breakaway group from the SRs, they gained the most seats. The cadets gained the second most seats. The SDs, remember they're the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, they gained 65 seats, and the SRs gained 37 seats. It was impossible for the Tsar and the new Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, to work with this Duma, who refused to support Stolypin's proposed land reforms, which I'll get to very shortly. In early June, the Socialist Democratic Labour Party were accused of plotting to overthrow the Tsarist regime. So Menshevik and Bolshevik deputies had their parliamentary privileges suspended, and the Second Duma was dissolved on the 3rd of June, 1906. Now, on that same day, the 3rd of June, Stolypin brought in sweeping changes to the electoral system, and voting was suspended in districts where, according to Tsar Nicholas, the population, and here's a quote, had not yet reached sufficient levels of civic development. Basically, what that means is they wanted to restrict voting in areas that voted for more revolutionary parties. So they were looking to increase the number of conservative votes. Groups like the Octoberists, minor conservative parties. And so these electoral reforms basically paved the way for the Third Duma to be far more conservative and less revolutionary. The Third Duma ran from November 1907 to June 1912. As we can see, the Octoberists, now they were a group that came about at the same time that the October Manifesto came about. They were loyal to the Tsar, but also believed in a constitutional monarchy. They were the most popular party. The national minority parties made up 97 seats, and the cadets, who were initially the most popular party, only gained 54 seats. So as a result of Stolypin's new voting laws, it did exactly as Stolypin intended, and the Tsar and Prime Minister achieved a more conservative and compliant Duma that would do as the Tsar said. According to Stolypin, this Duma was composed of responsible and statesman-like people, unlike those nasty revolutionaries such as the SRs and SDs. The Third Duma was elected in 1907 and permitted to serve its full 5-year term. The first time that had happened. Previously, the first two Dumas were dissolved after only a few months. That brings us to the Fourth Duma. Now, this is the last Duma that we're going to look at, and it ran from November 1912 to August 1914. The term of the Fourth Duma was plagued by mounting tensions and an increase in protests by industrial workers. It was actually, as you can see with this fourth dot point, it was arguably the most conservative of the Dumas, but the relationship between the parliament and government was strained, and Duma deputies became increasingly critical of the government. Now, the increase in protests was spurred on by an event that took place on the 12th of April, 1912, just before the Fourth Duma came into effect. And this is referred to as the Lena Goldfields incident. Now, the Lena Goldfields were in Siberia, in sort of central Russia. And this is an incident in which 500 miners who were on strike for better pay and conditions were shot by government forces, which drew comparisons to Bloody Sunday of 9th of January, 1905. In the same way that Bloody Sunday led to further industrial action and mounting tensions and an increase in protests, the exact same thing happened with the Lena Goldfields. So there's an example of continuity in terms of the response to an event such as this. Now, Prime Minister Stolypin was actually assassinated by revolutionaries prior to this in September 1911, and his death basically made the Duma, the relationship between the Duma and the government more strained. Now, Pyotr Stolypin, I've mentioned a few times, but he is a significant individual that deserves some further mention. So he is considered one of the last great statesmen of Russia's Tsarist era. As prime minister, he declared martial law, which basically means that the military and the police have much more power to, and less, there's less bureaucracy that they have to go through. So he declared martial law in an attempt to brutally crush the aftermath of the 1905 revolution. So this is at a time when the more revolutionary groups, the ones who weren't satisfied with the October Manifesto, they continued to protest, continued to get out into the streets. And so Stolypin declared martial law so as to crush that rebellion. This is an example of reaction. So between 1906 to 1913, an estimated 3,000 people were executed for terrorist and revolutionary activities. Stolypin became so well known for the executions committed under his role as prime minister that the hangman's noose became known as the Stolypin necktie. Stolypin introduced sweeping agrarian land reforms. Now, the first two Dumas who weren't on board with Stolypin and Tsar Nicholas and were far more critical of them, they kept blocking these land reforms. But eventually Stolypin pled Article 87, which, remember, that allows the Tsar to go above the Duma. And he brought in these land reforms, and the Third and Fourth Dumas were far more open to these land reforms. Now, these reforms basically gave peasants the opportunity to own private land. Now, that sounds great. It sounds as though this is an example of trying to give back to the workers and the peasants, but workers and revolutionaries saw through it. Basically, the reason is that Stolypin hoped to create a class of self-sufficient and prosperous peasants who would be more likely to obey and remain loyal to the government. He wanted to, this was a part of his response to the 1905 revolution. He was trying to quell the revolution by both reaction, in which he executed a number of revolutionary people, but he also wanted to do it through reform, where he would basically buy the loyalty of the peasants through his land reforms. Stolypin was assassinated by socialist revolutionary Dmitry Bogrov, and this was long before his land reforms actually had time to show any significant results. So that brings us to the start of World War I. Our next video will be on the First World War. But here is a brief summary of the causes of the revolution so far. We've still got 3 years until the February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar, and the October Revolution, which brought about Bolshevik rule. But here's a summary of where we've come from. First of all, Tsar Nicholas II was a weak and unprepared ruler. He himself declared that he was not prepared to be Tsar. So that didn't bode well for his rule. Sergei Witte's rapid industrialization, known as the Great Spurt, led to, and here is a quote from historian S.A. Smith, it led to urbanization, internal migration, and the emergence of new social classes, which set in train forces that serve to erode the foundations of the autocratic state. So basically what that means is all these people are coming to the cities, migrating to the cities, and the working class is growing, which set up the foundations of revolutionary fervor and revolutionary attitudes. The Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 was a devastating loss for Russia, a war that had intended to be a quick victory to quell any attempts at revolution, had the opposite effect. It was deeply embarrassing, and people were, it led to further protests and people being dissatisfied by the Tsar. Bloody Sunday, the very significant event of 9th of January 1905, whereby Father Gapon led a petition to the Winter Palace, and this procession of workers and their families were shot at, and many hundreds were killed. Now that led to an increased industrial action, which brought about the 1905 revolution, and as a result, the October Manifesto. What we've looked at today, the Duma was created, but the fundamental laws limited their power, and Stolypin's changes to the electoral laws made the Duma more compliant and conservative and less representative of the wishes of the people. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911, and the Lena Goldfields incident of 1912 rekindled the radical workers' movement. So that's just a brief overview of where we've come. I hope you found this video interesting and informative, and I will see you next time.